Potentially a harebrained idea, but I've already tested it out and it works brilliantly. Hello friends, and welcome to part 2 of my Edwardian jumper dress project. If you're new here, nice to meet you. My name's Shannon, and when I'm not busy swinging from the rafters, I like to make historically inspired creations, the latest one being this. It's the base skirt for today's project, which is to make a fully and easily removable bottom extension that will bring the hem much closer to floor length and bring the skirt much closer to being historically accurate. If you haven't seen part 1, I do recommend starting there. They will be linked in the description as well as up in the eye, and everything will just make a bit more sense, including my later review of the pattern that I used to make this skirt, which is the black snail jumper dress, because this is the second time that I made this pattern and I just thought it would be useful to share my honest thoughts and opinions on it. Before we jump to the attachment mechanism for the skirt extension though, I have to actually make it. I'll start by cutting out the bottom portion of every skirt panel, and as we saw last video, my base skirt was as long as the bottom of that wrapping paper, so now I'll just cut out everything else below that. So I quickly discovered that all these skirt panels look really similar to one another, so I again used a labeling system to make sure I had everything in the right order, and I'm so glad I did because I just know it saved me from making several mistakes. The next step was to sew all the panels together in the right order, but I really wanted to make sure the seams from the extension lined up with the seams on the main skirt, just to aid the illusion that this was all one long continuous skirt, so I actually went through and marked the width of each skirt panel by hand. I could have relied on using the same seam allowance as I did on the skirt, but that wouldn't account for human error, of which there is plenty in this sewing studio, so I checked each panel by hand just to be sure. The measuring and the pinning was fiddly, but then the sewing and the pressing went really quickly. One thing that I should mention, and that I actually wanted to talk about last video but forgot, was that I did actually test this skirt pattern out beforehand to make sure that it would work without all that historical padding. The pattern has much larger hip curves than I usually use on my skirts because it is a historical pattern and it is meant to accommodate historical silhouettes, so I did worry that it would sit a bit odd or maybe be a bit flat and empty around the hips when it was worn without a corset and bum pad and all of that historical accoutrement. So I tried on my Miss Frizzle skirt with normal modern underwear and was pleased to see that it did fit just fine. Otherwise, my project probably would have been dead in the water. And also, I do realize that everybody's body is different, and just because this held true for me, it might not hold true for you, so it is always good to try and do a little test just to be sure before embarking on a similar project. Okay, back to the sewing. Alright, I've just gotten all of the bottom pieces sewn together and serged up, and it went pretty smoothly, although I will say that something I almost forgot about was that the back of the skirt, at least for the full historical length, should technically be longer than the front because you're going to have all of that padding to give the historical silhouette. And that padding is going to be distributed over the hips and the bum, so those parts of the skirt just need more length to get a nice level hem. And sure enough, if you look at the center front pattern piece versus the center back piece, there's over 1.5 inches of difference. Fortunately, I remembered about this before I trimmed all of my panels down, and I was able to build that difference into the extension. And honestly, I'm pretty psyched about it. I think this really solves that perpetual problem of historical padding and hem length, because if you want to history bound and wear your skirt a bit more incognito without all that padding, then you need a hem that's going to be level in your everyday undergarments. But then if you want to have it be properly historical and you put on all of those undergarments, well, now your hem's going to be higher in the back than in the front. So this way, I feel like you can really have it all. You can have the shorter everyday length and a longer historical length, and both with level hems. It's just amazing. I think it's honestly genius. So everything is all serged together and ironed up, and now I'm going to spend probably more time than I'd care to admit making even more white trim so that I can lay both layers of the skirt out and play with the placement of the trim, see what I want that final pattern and spacing to look like. And I'm just going to be making that trim the same way I made it in the first video, taking the remnants of my white pillowcase and essentially just making a bias trim, but cut on a very slight bias so that it's a little bit stretchy. It'll go over the curves of that skirt easily, a little bit better than if it was a true bias, but still not wasting as much fabric. Well, friends, I think I have some bad news. I think I have to undo all that white trim, all of those hours and hours of stitching it on, and I think it's gotta go. So let me explain where I'm at. Yesterday evening, I spent a long time trying several different arrangements of white trim on the bottom, including a repeat of the same 2 bands as the base skirt. I tried 1 wide and 2 narrow in a couple different layouts. I tried 1 narrow, 1 wide, and 1 extra wide, and nothing looked good. So then I tried folding the extension to look like it has a deep pleat in it, almost like it was 2 different layers of fabric, which is very common for the period. And while I liked the look of the pleats, again, I just couldn't find a good way to balance it out with that white trim. I tried so many different arrangements and just nothing was working. I think I stitched myself into a corner when I put on the original white trim because it's very balanced for the original base skirt, but then trying to add the extra length on, it was just impossible to balance that out. All of the visual weight was in the middle of the skirt when I really felt like it should have been at the bottom. So then this morning I remembered that I had this fabric. This was also part of the fabric haul from last year, and I had picked it up because it is exactly the same color as the linen, and I thought back then that I could use it for this jumper dress, but back then I was definitely thinking more on the upper body, and I specifically had this image in mind. But this morning, I'm desperate, so I started playing with options on the skirt using this, and while I hate to admit it, I think this is absolutely the way to go. It does mean taking off all of the white trim and sacrificing all those hours of sewing. Plus, it does mean, unfortunately, that the base skirt by itself will be a bit more plain, but I just can't find another way to make that white trim work. And honestly, this is slightly more historically inspired in terms of the full-length skirt. There are so many examples of similar deep pleats and flounces and layering right at the very bottom of skirts around this time period. So that's what I'm going with. So it's gonna be out with the stitches and off with the white trim, and then we can talk about how we're going to be attaching these 2 layers together. So So the trim is finally all off of the bottom of this skirt, and it's time to start on the real assembly of the bottom portion. And I want you all out there watching to take a guess right now on how you think I'm going to be attaching these two layers of the skirt together. There are many options, so many ways to do it, but I want you to pick the one that you think I'm gonna use and go down in the comments right now and type it out. Go ahead and hit pause. I'll be here when you get back and put it on the record how you think I'm gonna do it. Okay, so how many of you guessed magnets? Because if you've been here for at least a few months, you'll know how much I enjoy hiding magnets in my clothing, most recently in my Outlander coat video, and I definitely wouldn't blame you for thinking that that's exactly what I'd use here, but no, I think I've actually found an even more creative solution. So when I was brainstorming how to do this, I came up with a list of ideas, but they all seem to have a fatal flaw: Velcro. It's sticky and fairly fast to apply, but it would absolutely ruin the drape of the main part of the skirt. Buttons and buttonholes would potentially work well, but they would be an absolute nightmare to install on a hem of this length. Magnets are lightweight and shouldn't overly affect the drape of the skirt, but they're also pretty slow to install, and you definitely would risk accidentally ripping off the bottom of your skirt if you stepped on it or if it got caught on something. So what is the ultimate method? This is called a button loop trim, and I'll link the one that I used in the description because this one is much more flexible and supple and lightweight than some of the other types that I've seen, which is going to be absolutely key for it not affecting the drape of the main skirt. But I'm actually not using this in the intended method because that would involve sewing on far more buttons than I have patience for. No, instead, I'm going to be sewing this trim onto both edges of the skirt and the extension, and then staggering the loops so that I can run a ribbon through them, essentially sort of locking them together while still being lightweight and very flexible. Potentially a harebrained idea, but I've already tested it out and it works brilliantly. Like, even better than I had hoped it would, and I think that, especially with the new design for the bottom flounces with that fluffy toile type fabric, it's going to be absolutely invisible. I honestly don't think I've ever seen this technique used before, although surely someone else has used it and I'm just oblivious. But I feel pretty confident in saying that I invented this for myself, at least. So let's get to work installing it and see how it actually turns out.
With the buttonhole trim attached to the hem of the base skirt, I then turned to the skirt extension, but I quickly realized that in order to position the trim properly, I should really figure out how exactly I wanted to divide the panel up into the two layers, where I wanted the horizontal tuck to lie, how deep I wanted it to be, and how large of a hem I was going to use.
So I had to do a bit of mathing and a lot of futzing to get these pleats all spaced out the size that I want, and taking into account things like overlaps and underlaps and pleats and frills. But now that I've got all that figured out, I went ahead and made this little story stick here so that I can quickly and easily transfer all of those key measurements all the rest of the way down this flounce. Is it a flounce? It's not a flounce, but you know what I mean. Regardless, I'm now going to take my story stick, go ahead and transfer all those measurements down these many meters of fabric, and then I can go ahead and get started with pleating and inserting frills and sewing everything down, and we'll be one step closer to being finished.
With the tucks all ironed in and the buttonhole trim sewn on, I started cutting apart my tulle fabric into strips, with the idea being to insert one line of pleats along the top edge and another just under the horizontal tuck, so that when the full skirt was assembled, the bottom edge of the base skirt would just look like another deep horizontal tuck and would visually unify the top and bottom parts of the skirt into one seamless, full-length, historically adequate garment. I planned it out so that with one seam I could both hold the pleats in place and create the horizontal tuck, and I had measured it out so that the depth of the tuck on the extension was the same distance as the line of stitching on the bottom edge of the base skirt, again just helping to create a feeling of cohesion between the two parts of the garment.
Okay, quick update for you because the extension is basically complete. The button loop trim is all on, both layers of the pleats have been sewn, and the ruffles are all inserted. Everything is all stitched down, so it is looking absolutely fantastic. Now, I did make a couple conscious design decisions that I thought were worth mentioning. One is that I decided to keep all of the ruffles in the skirt on the extension layer because I personally don't want that much frill and floof on the daily wear version of the skirt, so I've left this one with a very plain hem, but you could just as easily include the first layer of ruffles here as part of the main skirt if that was something that you desired. Also, speaking of hems, I went ahead and machine stitched the button loop trim onto the bottom of the skirt, which does mean that it has a visible line of stitching around the hem, which is something I'm sure a certain percentage of viewers are very adamantly against. They don't want to see any machine stitching on their hems, which I totally understand, and that's fine, but it's not something that bothers me personally. Plus, I actually wanted that line of stitches to be visible because I thought it would help give the full length skirt the illusion or the effect of having those multiple deep horizontal pleats in it, like so many of the historical designs that inspired this project. Hello, future Shannon here, just popping in to say that as I look more at the skirt, you can see that I was clearly having some tension issues with my machine, and that caused some puckering along the bottom edge of the skirt that I don't love. And I actually have a solution for that, which I'll tell you about in a second. If you're firmly on team no visible stitches though, you can easily stitch the button loops on in an invisible manner. I know because I quickly basted the trim on before running it through my sewing machine, and even though I was very hasty and sloppy with my stitches, as you can see here, they're basically invisible. So there's definitely a way to use the button loop method and have it be very discreet and basically invisible. So given the tension issues on my machine and looking at that clip of the basted hem versus the sewn hem, if I could go back and redo it, I'd actually take off the buttonhole trim, machine stitch the plain fabric to give that visual line of stitches to create the illusion of a deep tuck. Then I'd go in and hand stitch the buttonhole trim on top of the machine stitches. Just reflections on the project now that I've had some distance to reflect on it. So now all that's left to do, I think, is going to be to close up the center back seam here, because I had left it open until this point, just figuring it would be easier to do all the markings and insert all the trim and sew everything up if it was one long flat panel. But now that's all done, so I think it's basically time to close her up. Also, I just took a trip yesterday to a new thrift store here in the city. I wasn't specifically looking for fabric, but how could I pass this up? It was slightly more expensive than if I would have found it at my usual thrift store, but it was still a really good price for what looks like maybe 2 meters of fabric, roughly, in this really fun pattern and this great vintage colorway. It's super fun, and I'm really excited to make something with it, but maybe when it's a bit cooler outside, because it does feel like almost like flannel. It is a medium to heavyweight and potentially also has some synthetic fibers in here. So either way, something that's much warmer than I'm wanting to be making and wearing right now in this season, but maybe a potential Cape Timber project coming on right here. I don't know. Why don't you let me know in the comments what you would make if you came across a couple meters of this in your thrift store, and maybe I can find some inspiration in my comments section. But also, maybe not a skirt. Let's do something besides skirts. I think I'm all skirted out for now. Okay, before the final reveal, as promised, here is a quick review of this pattern, and I'll start it off by saying that I'm generally very much a fan both of the pattern and the garment it makes, and that there are just maybe a few things to keep in mind when deciding if you'd like to use it too. So, the pros. Black Snail is known for having a really good size range, so huge points for size inclusivity. Their patterns are very affordable for what you get, and they often have sales for an extra 10 to 15% off. They offer both printed and PDF downloadable versions of their patterns, which means more people can access the patterns in whichever format they need or prefer. The instructions come with a bit of general historical information about the time period of the garment, as well as some useful detailed instructions on various sewing techniques like catch stitch, gathering stitch, understitching. These are also accompanied by some images to help illustrate those techniques. This skirt pattern specifically is pretty easy to sew, apart from the placket, which I will talk about in a sec, and the numerous gores mean that nothing is cut on a huge bias, so the panels don't stretch out too much or want to drop, which definitely saves you time and hassle down the road. Also, if you hate sewing darts, like I do, there isn't a single dart to be found. And lastly, the skirt is very easy to do last-minute tweaks to because, as I mentioned in the previous video, you can sew all of the box pleats but one and then try it on and just fine-tune the size of that last pleat depending on how it fits you. Now the cons. Having made the skirt part twice and having used a portion of the torso pattern for my Miss Frizzle cosplay, I have to say that I found parts of the instructions very confusing, even with all of the images. We all saw me struggle with the placket instructions in the first video, and this might just be because their method is very different from my normal go-to method, so definitely take it with a grain of salt, but while some steps were very clear, I found others rather murky. On the other hand, once I did puzzle out the placket, it worked very nicely and was a super clean finish. I also didn't always find that the images were very clear or as helpful as they could have been, and whether that's because their placement in comparison to the related instructions was a bit strange, or because it's not marked which parts of the image are meant to represent the right side and the wrong side of the fabric, I don't know. Some drawings were very helpful, but others, not so much. Another thing to note, which I won't call a con, but which is just something to be aware of, is that the instructions assume that you want to use historical techniques only, and they don't provide any alternatives for faster or more modern methods of assembly. Which, I mean, I don't expect companies to list all possible ways to build their garments. That seems completely unreasonable, but just know that if you're a novice sewist who doesn't want to use historical techniques, you'll be on your own to decide which alternative methods and stitches you'd like to use. So would I recommend you buy the pattern? Yeah, I think if you like the way this skirt looks, either at the full length or at a shorter, more modern length, I do think it's a good pattern to use, and I just recommend maybe taking your time with the placket, using my previous video to help with the construction process if you get confused, but I do really like it as a skirt. But now I'm sure you're all itching to see how the actual final full-length skirt turned out, so let's take a look at it while I discuss my thoughts on this hybrid dual-length concept. If I had to rate the idea and the execution, I'd give it an 8 out of 10. Is it the most practical idea ever? No, not really. It doesn't take that long to lace the extension on, but it's not exactly lightning speed either. That being said, it is a really convenient solution for those of us who find ourselves in the position of admiring historical clothing and wanting to make it, but who also have a hard time justifying the large amount of time, effort, and materials spent on a garment that will probably only get worn once or twice a year. This way, you have a skirt that can seamlessly shift from a very cute, historically inspired design to a passable historical outfit in just a few minutes. Now, admittedly, this only works because I don't pad out to a perfectly historically accurate hip-to-waist ratio, but it's good enough for me, and strict historical accuracy has never been very high on my list. The highlight of this project was definitely just finding out that my technique for attaching the skirt extension with those interlocking button loops worked, and it worked flawlessly. The only negative, if I had to find one, is that I wish I had thought the design through a bit more and found one that would leave me with a base skirt that was a little more decorative or embellished. I really liked the white stripes on the hem and find it looks a little bare without them. But what do you think? Was this technique successful in your opinion? Have you seen it or something like it before? And if so, where? Would you be interested in trying it out in your own wardrobe? And if so, how? Let me know down in the comments. Thanks once again for watching, and as always, I'll catch you in my next video. Bye! Ok, Kana, est-ce que tu veux aller manger? C'est l'heure de manger? Time to go get a corgi some puppy food.